Okay, cool. We're recording. So, yeah, so we're doing a book club about the book High Output Management by Andy Grove. It's the first book listed on our leadership books page. So we thought it would be interesting to go through that. Neither Rachel or I have read it before. So if you have, you're definitely ahead of us so far. Um, as we just talked about, I'm going to put this on YouTube if possible. We will have a segment at the end that is not recorded if people want to talk about confidential things. But in general, the audience, the people who are in this book club, sort of span quite different parts of the company. So we don't want to spend too much time sort of going into too much specific detail about particular parts of the organization. And if we do find that we're doing that, maybe we need to adjust that for future book clubs. So the first thing I'm curious about is what people are hoping to get out of this book club. And Rachel, I guess if you kick off there, that would be great.
Sure. Well, one of the things that attracted me to this particular book very much is Intel is a very, very successful organization, and since Andy Grove is one of the first set of employees to be part of that company, I'm really interested to just see his observations about a company that is this truly successful, and any insight that he's able to share, I think, would be exceptionally valuable. So I'm just looking to learn what he thought was important.
Great. And I should say as well, if anybody else wants to jump in at any point, feel free to do so. Rachel and I decided we would start this as a conversation between ourselves with the intention that it's easier for other people to join a conversation rather than picking people who are perhaps not ready to jump in and say something. So if you want to join in, feel free. This is a conversation. For me personally, yeah, it's pretty similar. Also, I like that. So, well, from what I've read so far, but also from what I understood about the book initially, it's got like quite a specific focus on the high output part of the title. It's not a completely generalist book. It has a very specific focus on processes and output of those processes and how you measure those, how you improve the output as well. So that was interesting to me. I'll give a couple of seconds for anybody else to jump in with anything that's specific they're looking for from this book club. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next section.
I mean,
okay.
There's one thing obviously that I'm trying to. Yeah, sure. I thought I'll give everyone a chance to talk first. No, of course, the book itself, I'm trying to get out of the book club. But the reason why we're doing this as a book club is because I also hope to learn from other people's stories and experiences, and perhaps knowledge and wisdom from other books they've read. Otherwise, we could have just read this by yourselves without this book club. So there you go. I'm hoping to learn a lot from all of you.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's a good point. So Rachel and I have. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying, I think we discussed this, neither of us have ever run a book club before, so you'll probably be able to tell that as we go through. But we have some sort of like general plan here, and then we will sort of try and make each edition of this book club better than the last one. To start with, we had some things that jumped out to us from the introduction and from the first couple of chapters. So for this part of the book club, we read the first part of the book, which is the first two chapters. It's actually quite short. We've split this book club into parts, excuse me, and it turns out that the first and third parts are much shorter than the second and fourth parts, I think. But the introduction itself was really interesting to me because, first of all, from the introduction, at least in my version, it's apparent this book was written a long time ago, because the introduction is talking about how email is changing the world of work. And that's interesting in a couple of ways. First of all, it sort of helps date it as a historical artifact, and it's also talking about globalization as the other thing that's changing the world of work. But Christopher says it wasn't that long ago. Christopher, you are right, but I think there are some people on this call who weren't born when the first edition of this book was written. So just bear that in mind. The interesting thing to me, though, is that in the introduction, what Andy Grove talks about is how that does change some of the specifics, but it doesn't actually change a lot of the fundamentals, which again is sort of like it's the book talking about itself, so it's not an unbiased source, but that sort of recommends it to me that like these aren't skills or techniques that are specific to a specific type of technology or anything like that. And then some interesting things there. So first of all, I don't think every single person on this call is a manager, but most people are. One thing it did mention in the introduction, which you might call a subject matter expert, perhaps sometimes, or like, we have a technical path in engineering for people to have significant influence on the engineering organization without being managers, is this idea of know-how managers, who are sources of knowledge, skills, and understanding to people around them in an organization. So does anybody have any thoughts on how what this book has so far would apply to people who aren't people managers, but are perhaps experts or these know-how managers? Rachel, if not, I'll pick on you.
I'm thinking how to frame my answer because I wasn't quite expecting the question. I think that one of the things, it's important for people also to recognize that, there's, we might talk about this later, but that there is leadership and management. And I think that both different types of people exhibit those traits. But when we're looking at know-how managers in the context of the first chapter, I think I'm interested to know if know-how managers also think about measuring the output of what they're doing or what their team's doing, or if that is strictly a management trait. But and I think that I also appreciated very much that he called out the specific difference between the kinds of people, because I very much appreciate that over the past couple of years, there's definitely been this trend that the correct career progression for engineers is not just to make them managers, because it's a very different type of job that you're doing. And for a long time, I think engineers felt that the only way to advance was to become management, and then you stop coding and you stop, being part of the day-to-day of how the tests run. And, that can be quite frustrating for some people. So it's interesting to know that all the way back in 1983, there was already this idea of there's two different things here. It's not just you get promoted into management. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's just what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, I did say at the start, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but I will give a bit of context for engineering, because I think that does have a good mapping where, and I think from speaking to Todd briefly, there's a similar sort of thing that happens in marketing as well, where you have people who may be senior, but not managers. And part of that seniority is having influence, right? Is having some wider impact than just their own work. Whether it's improving our processes, whether it's training other people or mentoring other people, there is some way in which these people who are more senior, who are not managers, make the rest of the organization better, not just themselves. And I think that's sort of the key part to me here. But like you said, I did find it interesting that this book sort of explicitly called that out, given that it's something that very much fits into our model today, and is a thing we actually talked about at Contribute in a plug for the workshop I helped run.
Yeah, Melody, I had seen that you've unmuted. I wasn't sure if you wanted to chip in.
Yes, thank you. I was going to just comment that I think that's a good point, what you said, Rachel, about know-how managers and having indicators and things for themselves. I previously was at my other job, had a team that I was managing. But now I don't. And before we had lots of indicators. And when I read that part in the book, I thought, oh, I could do that for myself too, especially around productivity. I feel the remote environment. This is my first time working remote. I've been at GitLab 3 months tomorrow. And so I feel my productivity has really gone down, to be honest. And so I think putting some indicators in place that would help me see what I'm doing and when and how long things are taking me would help me be more productive and have better output.
So that's just based on the first 2 chapters. Is that right, Melody?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where it said in the beginning where it was talking about indicators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting actually, because I felt very much the same. Like I've literally only read the first 2 chapters. I've not read ahead at all yet. But even then I was like, oh wait, maybe I should do some of the stuff that's already like, you know, in these first 2 chapters. So it's interesting that like a few of us have had that, or at least a couple of us have had that reaction. I think Rachel mentioned something similar as well.
Yeah, and I thought like the knowing your metrics and tracking those accordingly in marketing, that's something that, you know, that we're doing, and we're now trying to go down a few layers deeper as we further segment, you know, between sales. So I've known that, but it was always a good reminder. And the other thing that I thought was interesting too, it was around, you know, kind of the burn down charts and then the black box where you can inspect your process and then look at it at different points throughout your process.
The other thing I wanted to add is also where they talk about leading indicators. And in my previous, or in one of my previous jobs, I had much more involvement with the sales organization, and the head of sales would often talk about leading indicators, and I could never really make it properly fit and make sense. So it was really interesting to now read it in this context and actually have a much better understanding of what they were actually trying to achieve then. And then also interesting that Leslie, you would talk about burn down charts, because I can imagine, I mean, on engineering, we use those all the time. So I can see how different people reading this book will be getting different things out of it for sure.
Yeah, I think I might be jumping ahead to section 2, but like where you track everything you do in a day. I don't remember if that was section 1 or section 2, but I thought that was a very interesting exercise.
Yes. Sorry, just one thing I wanted to note about the quotes that Rachel and I picked out here, or 2 things, first of all. Sorry. One, we just picked out these quotes, like, you know, we're welcome to like go off these. These are more like a framework for if we're not really getting, you know, if the discussion starts to slow down. Second of all, the quotes that we picked all seem to be from the introduction in chapter 2. So I guess chapter 1 is doing a lot of table setting, but chapter 2 seems to be where we started to like, you know, really get into stuff that resonated with us. So I assume that it's the same in marketing, Leslie, that like across GitLab as a whole, we are focusing more on getting solid KPIs, key performance indicators, like in and reporting and having that like accessed in a consistent way across the organization. Is that something that marketing are working on as well?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Have you found it? So one of the quotes that it mentioned, which I felt like I disagreed with, and I could see a way in which I could agree with it, is where it says any measurement is better than none. And I feel like you can pick really bad measurements. Like you can measure totally the wrong thing. But I can see the argument that maybe what the book is trying to say is if you pick a bad measurement, you will find that sooner than waiting forever to pick the perfect measurement in the first place. But have you found it easy to like pick those KPIs and like actually like, even if you picked the right thing, easy to measure it?
Probably combination of both, yes and no. And I think we had one tool that we were using to build out our dashboards from a company standpoint. Now we're in the process of switching. So as long as you understand, I think, so we went through an exercise of pulling out measurements. We were like, we don't really know that this is accurate or that we agree with it. So we didn't make any big decisions based on that data. It was more or less going through the exercise of getting all the parties involved and pulling data and actually looking at something and then iterating from there. So I think as long as you have the context and the understanding of, this is a first measurement, this is an MVC of a measurement, you don't make any rash decisions on it, and I think that's totally fine. But I did struggle with that, Sean, as well. It's like, do I agree with this? Do I not agree with that?
So just a bit of an observation there. I think it was circa 2006. One of the CTOs actually bought a vineyard. I think it was 2004 out in Napa Valley, and I got an opportunity to go visit it. It was pretty interesting to see how this particular person had optimized some of their processes around actually making wine in the kind of similar fashion. In particular, they actually installed sensors every 5 feet and were recording every 5 minutes, air pressure, water vapor, temperature, around that. So like, and the quote that was given was, is that Intel, if there's something that's measurable, we'll measure it, is kind of the philosophy. So it was a definite mindset of don't worry about thinking in terms of a bad measurement, think in terms of just measuring everything and then looking at the data after the fact and kind of understanding what's going on. If it's technically feasible to measure something, measure it from that perspective. Which sounds like, yeah, you could have bad measurement data, but like it's the interpretation of the data that's probably the key aspect there. At least that's my observation.
Yeah, I think my wariness around this is probably like more on me than on the book. But also I just looked it up whose law it is, because it's one of these that's like named after someone, which is Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure, or basically you get what you measure. So if you're measuring something that is, and I think chapter 2 does talk about this to a certain extent in terms of measuring output and not measuring activity, because if you measure activity may go up, but output may not go up, right? Like you might just end up with people doing busy work and accomplishing less overall. So I think that's where my concern came from. But I also wonder if just that context, that Intel context, like informed this, and without me having that context, I didn't sort of realize where that was coming from, that you just measure it if you can, and then you figure it out later.
Yeah, I think it's more of discerning between optimization and measuring, right? So like the challenge is on a lot of situations, you don't know going into it what's the right measurements. You have to actually discover that, and actually they change over time as well, depending on how you want the organization to move and be effective. So consequently, that's kind of what I've seen. Is I've actually seen where like one measure will be a great measure for 2 or 3 years, and then the team will actually change based on the fact of understanding the fact that like we no longer want to optimize this, but we'll still have it, but we just don't want to be the leading indicator or optimization.
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess that can also happen with like the organization maturing, right? Like, the less mature it is, the sort of like the broader the measures can be, and then like you might have almost solved that problem, and it's something you want to keep an eye on, but it's not it's no longer I guess a key performance indicator. It's just a performance indicator maybe. Did anybody have anything that came to them that they could start measuring?
Sorry, I see Thomas wanted to chip in on that before we move on to the next piece.
Sorry, Thomas.
I have a very loaded question to ask, and I know it going into it, but I'm going to do it anyway. So on the topic of measuring what you can, and on the observation of measure output rather than activity, if we were to turn this into a very engineering specific conversation, noting that we very closely monitor merge requests and number of merge requests per engineer, are we convinced that we are measuring output rather than activity?
Yeah, I mean, I will take that one.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really, really good question, and we could talk to death about this, so I'm not going to dive too much into it. But I put in a quote because I've been thinking about this as everyone's been talking this morning. I really like that as he's talking about measures, he also talks about measuring quality. So I agree with you. Throughput does measure activity to some extent, but the way I like to look at throughput is paired with quality metrics. So what I say is I'd like the team to go small and fast, but we need to monitor quality, because if quality is going down, then all we're doing is bad activity. So I very much buy into engineering metrics is more than one data point. And the way you get visibility into the health of the team is having these different measures come together and put in a view of the health of the team. All right. I'll stop.
Let me ask the second question that comes to mind, because my understanding of this particular measurement is to encourage engineers to break work down. And I completely agree with that. My question there is the effort to break down merge requests really at the right spot? Should it be more of an encouragement to break issues down rather than to break it into multiple merge requests itself? Because then it becomes a more nuanced status reporting conversation. And I'm sorry for turning this directly into an engineering conversation, but I was really thinking about this over the weekend.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. First of all, this gets back to, is MRs the right things? Like you could pick lines of code, you could pick MRs, you could pick commits, you could pick issues, right? Like all those are appropriate things. And I think right now we settled on MRs, but like over time we may actually choose to move it based on where we see the actual where we see the need to move the needle. You mentioned that the metric was created specifically to encourage the breaking of things down to be smaller parts. I wouldn't necessarily articulate that way. MRs is what we're using to evaluate how we're doing as an organization and say whether we're doing a good job or not. I wouldn't characterize it as we're encouraging people to break down MRs because of the metric. We're encouraging people to break down MRs because we think it's the right thing to do. So it's not contradictory, because that's the big thing is people say, oh, well, I'm going to optimize the metric, I'm going to just break down MRs. When we say that's a good thing, like that's not a bad thing, right? So it's not in. Dalia may disagree with me, but I view it as not as the intent of the metric as much as it's the outcome is not necessarily a negative consequence of the metric.
So Christopher, is this potentially one of those metrics that you were talking about before where 2 years from now, we don't care about this as much? Like we've moved on to a different way of tracking this sort of stuff?
Yeah, and that's kind of the way I think about it. Like I think we'll still have it, because we'll still record it and measure it. But the fact of the matter is that we may choose a different metric to say, okay, this is how we evaluate our productivity. Do you have anything to add? I know that's kind of slightly contradictory, but it's that's a very subtle point that I think is important to kind of recognize, is that, breaking down MRs is a great thing. We should encourage to do that regardless of what we're measuring.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I've said this a few times. What I like about throughput is that it creates, people talk about gaming the metrics, and this is one of those where go ahead and game it, because you are actually achieving what we'd like to see from a behavioral standpoint. There is a natural, people could get silly and you can, create an MR for every line, but at the end of the day, that's not abiding by our definition of done. So it will not on its own go into production and survive, for instance, is one way to look at it. And second, we have checks and balances like code review and maintainer review. So I feel like from the sense of, are we encouraging the right behavior with this metric? Yes. Is it the measure that we're getting some value out of? I agree with Christopher. Right now, I think that is the case. We can revisit it. Again, without diving too much into it, the background here is that we found that working with the GateLab product, it was much easier to break down to multiple MRs instead of multiple issues, because it was really nice to have the issue, have the full context of what you're trying to implement, and have flexibility to break your MRs to very, very small deliverables that together are like Lego pieces that then complete the picture for the issue. But again, as we evolve our practices, we can revisit that anytime.
Well, I think that was a great question and good discussion there. I think just in the interest of keeping this at a high level, I think we would be best to move on to the next item. Passing it back to Sean.
Yeah, so I think we talked about the sort of general measurement stuff, and also about pairing the indicators, where I think Dalia mentioned this as well, but the book specifically says it's good to pair indicators, and ideally, in fact, Dalia's quoted it, that's perfect. Ideally, you're pairing something that measures quantity or output with an indicator that measures quality in some way. And Rachel, you had some thoughts on the different types of inspection and monitoring the book talked about?
Yeah, I was, it seems fairly obvious in hindsight, but it was just really nice to see it laid out that clearly, that there's two different kinds of activities here, that there's actually a gate-like inspection where everything has to stop here and be checked. And the second type where you're just monitoring what's happening, and where not everything needs to be observed, but perhaps you're looking at a percentage of cases that go through this point to check that in general the health of this activity is fine. And that's really got me thinking about the way that that my team does things, and just checking, which activities do we perform that need to be gate inspections, and which ones can actually be monitoring inspections, because that can actually it can affect how fast we move, but it also then impacts what type of quality we're producing, and we need to be mindful of both of those. But at least it's got me thinking about what actions we're taking for what reasons. So I thought that was a really that's perhaps one of the biggest things that I've taken away from this first part of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll give people a couple of seconds to jump in. If not, Christopher. Oh, you've got to leave in 3 minutes. So what can you cover of your thoughts in 3 minutes, I guess?
Yeah, you were talking about chapter 1. Actually, I thought it was kind of interesting, and this is just an observation that it talks about the critical step and basically the long pole, which people may call critical path if they're familiar with like more traditional ways of doing software development or project management. It's interesting because I don't know if I could articulate. My last job, I could clearly articulate what our critical path was and what we were trying to optimize to, at least for an organizational perspective. I don't know if I could articulate that right now for this organization or the company. So if anybody has any suggestions there, I'd love to hear feedback on that from that perspective.
As far as most expensive part of workflow?
Yeah.
Okay. I can name 3.
Okay.
Planning, because we're trying to do too big of a chunks even with monthly releases. Maintainer review, because it's too scarce of a resource. Onboarding of new engineers to make them fully productive.
Okay, but you only get one, right? And then you optimize everything else around it. So,
well, I would argue they're different. I'd argue they're different planes. But if I were to articulate trying to get, if we were to try to optimize around throughput, it would be around maintainer review.
Yeah, well, I would argue planning and maintainer review are too closely linked. Maybe onboarding is separate. That's a fair bit of feedback. Is that you got to look at different parts of the organization optimize, and then when they conflict, that could kind of work it from that perspective.
So one way I think about this, which I think we talked about before, Thomas, as well, was that at GitLab in general, because we work asynchronously, like, we don't have the feedback loop like as tight as it could be all the time. We find that makes us more efficient. But it does mean that we are optimizing for bandwidth, i.e. getting a lot of things done over like the latency of getting a particular thing done. So that critical step can be quite long. We're okay with a step being quite long if we're not blocked completely. Like if we're doing other things at the same time, that's okay. I was trying to think of a way to fit this into a breakfast factory analogy to match the book, and I failed. But I think that's sort of what we optimize for. So I don't know if that helps or not, but that's the way I think about how we do that. And certainly in engineering and product development. I don't know if, in marketing or in finance or in sales, for instance, it's the same thing, or if there we do have like blocking steps that will just like bring everything to a halt for a while.
Yeah, I would be really interested. So I'd be really interested to hear from outside of the engineering organization to what blocking steps might be. I find it interesting to find out about processes in other teams, because it's so often they actually do encourage us to think inside of engineering as well about how things are related. So yeah, I'd be very interested to hear from others as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different disciplines within marketing, and there can be lots of different blocking functions that happen. I don't really have a great example that I can give that I think this group would benefit from off the top of my head. I don't know, Marcia, from the sales side, if you have anything that you think you could add.
I'm still pretty new, so it's been really interesting to hear everyone talk from outside of sales. I would say ask me again in a couple weeks, because I'm still trying to even coordinate. I mean, we're trying to coordinate like the onboarding. There's so many new people that have started that it's pretty insane. So like this week I'm trying to work on setting up a process to get all of these people that have.
I think that's going to be like one of the biggest blockers. Right,
yes.
From a sales standpoint, and kind of marketing too, because we have processes that I will say from field marketing, I will not say this for anyone else in marketing, but we could learn from engineering in terms of how well you all document everything. We are getting better, but we're building processes as we go. So I think that's a big blocker right now internally.
I would agree. I mean, there's nothing documented in the handbook. So that's been my biggest struggle. So, I mean, that's sort of something that I'm hoping to work on, is because there's no resource, like there's nowhere to go. And so basically, you know, when I defer back to my manager, Ryan O'Neill, he's like, well, we have to build it. It's not, people forget how new this company actually is. And what's left to be done.
So would you say there that having things in the handbook is unblocking people because, so my reaction would be, from an engineering perspective, that unblocks people because they don't need to wait for someone to respond to them. They can just go look it up themselves and they can move on with their day. And also, if they have a question about that, they can refer back to it in the future. Is that what you're thinking of there, Marsha? Or is there some like other thing that would help there?
If there's somewhere to go to ask a question or to figure out how to do something, it's going to speed up on all levels, right? But there isn't a lot of that documented. We don't have that. It hasn't been built out yet.
Right. So I guess what I'm hearing is that a lot of the pain in the onboarding is just like asking questions and waiting for answers.
Yeah. Or maybe people not even knowing what questions to ask. It could even be that granular.
Right, I see. So like, you know, not even knowing, not having that overview of like how everything fits together as well.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Thank you. So yeah, I did think when you said ask me in a couple of weeks, I was like, well, the next book club's in a couple of weeks. Maybe I should make a note to come back to you there, but
Okay.
I'll skip that.
Yeah.
Leslie, you had something you wanted to talk about as well about getting rid of the bad egg early.
Yeah, that's something that I try to. It goes in line with our value of iteration, which is probably one of the values that I struggle the most with personally. I'm a perfectionist, and so I always I try to get information out there as soon as possible, but I keep noticing that maybe it's like not soon enough, so I'm working on that. But I think, you know, that way you're not spending more time and effort on something that's not going to produce what you think it's going to produce. I don't know if anybody else has experienced that or has any thoughts on
that. So I'm just gonna, while people think about if they have any thoughts on that, I'm just gonna sort of. So what I remember from the book was this was talking about the breakfast factory analogy that it uses all the way through, and it's saying, if you have a bad egg in your batch, like or you know, in your process pipeline, the earlier you find that, the cheaper it is, because you know, if you get that ready to serve to the customer, or if you serve it to the customer and then it goes back, that's like incredibly expensive to fix. If you find it before you even start cooking it, then it's a lot cheaper.
Yep.
So my question there, coming in late, sorry for joining the book club late and other meetings, would be detecting the bad egg in the case of the breakfast factory was easy, but how in the case, you know, for Leslie in marketing or for engineering, do we detect the equivalent of that bad egg? It's bad code, it's bad idea in the program. So my question to try to help answer is like, what monitoring do you have in place for that? Where are you opening up the egg cartons and checking for the bad eggs beforehand? So I think sometimes it's just the application of you're doing some kind of measure there, because most of the time we just aren't. We're just shipping, you know, I hate to say it, but we're shipping minimum viable increments all the time in code for us in engineering. So how are we inspecting our code and verifying that we're shipping good code? You know, for me, I care about .com. So how do we prevent that bad piece of code from going to .com? Have the same problem with prior companies. Like, there's another part of me that the reaction of some of the site reliability folks is to just monitor as much as we can, so that as soon as it hits .com and it's causing a problem, we can get back to engineering and provide the feedback as soon as possible.
And I think from a field marketing standpoint, a lot of times it's the getting on site and choosing one type of event or workshop to run and going through and running that. And then, but what's the downside of that is, well, sales needs more and wants more now. So if I'm waiting to see the output of one of my events, then can I afford to take the time to do that, and what's the result of that going to be?
So in that case, you're seeing like how well the event works before you try and roll it out further. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Okay, and then the need is just to like do more of these events, like, and make them better as we learn stuff. I guess anyway.
Yeah, but then the other thing you have to factor in is that, well, every region is different. That's one of the reasons that we have regional marketing, is so what is awesome in San Francisco is not going to be the same down in Alabama, or Alabama's a huge focus for us right now, so that was a bad example, but say Florida. So those are two completely different territories. So, David, your point is really valid in terms of where are you inspecting, and I think just kind of pointing out, like I mentioned, what are you holding back if you're, not holding back, but what is the company potentially missing out on if you're not moving forward as quickly? And of course, sales always wants more now.
Can sales articulate exactly what they want more of now?
I mean, ish.
I think that's just a common thing in startups. I mean, startups are always, sales is always super ambitious, and that's part of the kind of tension that gets created in the startup between sales wanting to sell and product wanting to build them to sell, and engineering wanted to produce what product wants to give sales to be able to sell. And that's a massive challenge in any organization. And what's exciting about the position that GitLab's in at the moment is we can define how that pipeline gets set up so that the planning flows down nicely in engineering and the product flows nicely back up to sales to be produced out. And that also comes to what you were saying about adding to the handbook and documenting everything, because that's essentially what makes a process like this successful. And what's also I found really interesting at working at GitLab is that anyone can go and contribute to how to make this process better from each side, flowing down into the product and back up into sales. And so just coming back to that, I think it's interesting to say that, and I have heard that in startups a lot. And
I think I was just thinking as well, like, because in Intel's case, like, they've had some issues recently, in fact, which are incredibly expensive to fix because of the work they do, because it involves hardware, because it involves large scale manufacturing. And almost, I feel like, to what Dave was saying, sometimes when we have something that's not that expensive to fix, it's easy to underestimate, like, or it doesn't feel that expensive to fix. It's easy to underestimate the cost of that getting through, because, like, you feel like you're just sort of dealing with code and stuff, like, you can patch it, you can fix it next time. Like, it can be easy to swing too far the other way when you don't have all those physical moving parts in place, and sort of underestimate that. One thing I did want to call out here was, we said we'd have a potential non-recorded section at the end of the call. Right now we have 5 minutes for that. So we can wrap up in the recorded section, or if people want to discuss something in a non-recorded section, please put something in the Zoom chat now, basically. We weren't really sure what the demand for this would be on the previous book club that former director of engineering ran at GitLab. It was about crucial conversations at the book, which, a lot of what you talk about there is, like, by nature, like, emotionally charged situations, difficult situations to deal with. So it was helpful to have that not be public. This book so far seems to be more high level, I would say, and maybe we don't need the non-recorded section, but we'll probably give the option every time, either way. Okay, nobody said anything in Zoom, so I'm going to assume that we're good to just keep going for the last few minutes. Dalia, did you want to talk about the black box portion to probably wrap us up, please?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to highlight it because I found I really related to what he was saying about, black box and peering, like looking in. So in my previous practice, just looking over engineering metrics, that's very much what we do week to week, which is, throughput is high. We could ask questions, and having some of these debugging type of numbers has been really helpful. So you can dive in and figure out what is this data telling you. So I just wanted to call it out. And Sean, to what you were talking about in the previous comment, one of the ways that I found with having multiple data points, it is, you were talking about like the cost of making a change and measuring. So we, one of the things we would use, because again, back to why you would like to track multiple data points, is that if a team cycle time to turn around a fix was extremely low, that team could, by nature, was able to take much more risk than a team that needed multiple days to turn around a fix in production. So that made the cost of going fast, and yes, it's code, we're going to make mistakes, and it's perfectly fine as long as the impact was really, really low and we could turn it around fairly quickly. It was easier to make a case for some, potentially being a little bit on the riskier side, whereas a team that really needed quite a feat to get to that point would need to focus on their quality ahead of going fast, for instance. Just adding that in.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I think that sort of point about being able to correlate those different things is very useful. And that might go back to Christopher's point as well, and Dave's as well. If you measure it, you might not need it, but you'll be glad if you do need it and you already were measuring it, rather than being like, oh, I wish we'd started measuring this 6 months ago, so we could know what the trend was here. So yeah, I think that's a good point. I'm going to start wrapping up now because we've got 2 minutes left. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining and contributing to the conversation. I really appreciate it. Rachel will be facilitating the next call, which is in 2 weeks on the 17th of June. This section is management as a team game. The first chapter I just noticed was about managerial leverage, which was one of the quotes we didn't get to there, about the 3 ways of increasing productivity, increasing the rate of work, leverage, and work simplification. That section is longer, as Thomas pointed out. So, you've got 2 weeks to read it, but please bear that in mind when you're going through. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And we'll speak to you all in 2 weeks.
Just one quick process question.
Oh,
sorry.
Yep.
Should we be adding questions and comments before the meeting?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I should have said. So this isn't working exactly like a regular GitLab meeting agenda. We just thought we'd seed it with some stuff. But yes, if something jumps out to you, please go ahead and add it straight to this agenda just as you're reading it. And then we can sort of corral that closer to the time as well, because basically it makes mine and Rachel's job easier. So we really appreciate if you do that.
Awesome. Thank y'all very much. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.